Yes, so welcome to this first session about international perspectives on sustainability. We are now going to talk about a very practical tool called the Theater Green Book, and Paddy Dillon, that you can see already here, is the coordinator of the Theater Green Book. Before we start, I want to say a warm thank you to the Kulturstiftung des Bundes and to Sebastian Brünger for the invitation, and as well for the initiative of the Klimawerkstatt to connect, exchange, and find common tools and practices within sustainability practices. Because we do all know most of the facts about climate change, and now there are a lot of tools on the table, and it's time to practice what we preach and keep the wheel moving. And especially to make the theater act. I mean, this world is already at the center of theater, and we should do it, we should act. In the following 40 minutes, we will present the Theater Green Book and the practical tools behind it. And then afterwards open to a discussion, and we're happy to answer all questions that come up, or go into a general discussion. Shortly, because I have been saying we, so who is this we? We have Paddy Dillon here. He is theater architect, and he was part of the team to do the renovation of the reinvention of the National Theatre of London under sustainable parameters. He's the chairman of the International Theatre Engineering and Architecture Conference, and as I already mentioned, the coordinator of the Theater Green Book. This book consists of 3 parts. The first part that we're going to talk about today, about sustainable productions, and then later this year, 2 sessions will follow, 2 books. The second one on sustainable buildings, and the third one on sustainable operations. My name is Carmen Hornbostel. I'm dramaturg at the City Theatre of Gent, the Gent in Belgium. And we are going to test the guidelines of the Theater Green Book in one of our next productions called Grief and Beauty, directed by Milo Rau, who is as well the artistic leader of the Gent. And Grief and Beauty will connect to the Green Book and the guideline that already the title suggests a connection to our nature. At Gent, we are constantly working on sustainability on 3 levels parallelly. So on the operative level, on the artistic level, and on the theoretical level. And I could give you now examples of artists we are working with, on organizations. I could tell you that we're using 100% ecological electricity and electronic cars. But for me, the question is, are we not at a time that it should be the other way around? That we don't put, this is 100% recycled paper that we use. Shouldn't it be that we only sign up, put a note, attention, this is not 100% recycled, or attention, this is not a sustainable show? We should already start thinking the other way around, because time is running. And there's this feeling that the complexity of the topic and all the connections keep or hold us back from actually acting consequently. The fear that we could exclude other aspects makes us just do nothing often, or maybe we just keep each other busy with trying to reinvent the wheel instead of making it move. So the structural and practical changes that we need at theaters will consume and demand time, and we only have 8.5 years, more or less, time to effectively reduce our CO2 emission. So not a lot. And if we don't start to think practically and pragmatically now and start the changes, it will be too late, even we have created the most inventive solution. So the question for me is not about an aesthetics of change, but to put change first and have a change of aesthetics. And with this, I want to give the word to Paddy, who will now in detail talk about the Green Book and show as well, give some inside views how it looks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carmen, and thanks everybody for coming along today and giving us this chance to talk about the Theatre Green Book initiative, which has come about because of COVID, because theatres in the UK, as they are across the world, have been closed, and that's given theatre makers a chance to think again about how we make work and how we want to reopen when COVID comes to an end. Now, I think theatre makers across Europe have been talking for 10 years, for 20 years, for more in some cases, about how to respond to the climate emergency and how to make work within the parameters of the climate emergency. And that's true in Britain as well. Theatre makers, activists, politicians have been talking about how to adapt theatre, how to move theatre forward towards a way of working responsibly in the parameters of the crisis that we're facing. But when, at the start of COVID, we started bringing together theatre makers of all kinds, directors, writers, designers, production managers, to talk about it, what I was hearing from everybody was a sense of frustration that despite all of that passion, despite all of that commitment, real progress towards a more sustainable way of theatre making was not starting to come together. And in the course of a lot of conversations last summer, on Zoom in our bedrooms because we weren't allowed to go to offices, we started to work out how it was that we could actually start to generate meaningful change. And I think we realized three things. Firstly, we realized that we had to bring together sustainability specialists with theatre makers. Sustainability specialists, because this is a specialist area. Within theatre, there's only a limited understanding of the complex carbon calculations and methodologies that are needed to decide what matters most and what matters less. And theatre makers, because theatre, as you all know, is so specialist, it's so unlike any other world. What each of you does in making a production is so particular and so interconnected that meaningful guidance that people could follow and still make really special, really wonderful theatre productions could only come by the inclusion of theatre makers themselves. That was the first thing we realized. The second thing was that to create change in theatre making was not about some new engineering, it was not about some new invention, it was about looking at it holistically. And so, to take an example, a designer joining a show may not want to make it sustainably, but unless the producer allows time for it, unless the director is supportive, unless the constructor of scenery is using sustainable materials, she or he will not achieve progress. And we realized that making a production is so interconnected that we could only achieve meaningful change by working out what everybody involved in the production needs to do differently and what they need to expect everybody else to do differently as well. I think the third thing we realized was that we had to produce guidance that everybody would use. There was no point all of the theatres in the UK, all of the theatres across Europe coming up with different sets of guidance based on different methodologies and tested against different baselines. Because theatre makers are moving from theatre to theatre the whole time and from production to production and working with teams that they might not have met before. So we needed to create a common standard that everybody could share, a language that everybody could share, a way of working that people could take from one show to the next, so that sustainable practice could become sublimated into their normal way of making work. Now that meant a couple of things. It meant firstly that we needed to reach out to everybody who was already working in this field and bring together the existing guidance in one place so that we didn't have 5 or 6 different standards for making theatre sustainably. We only had one. It also meant that we needed to come up with guidance that could work for theatre makers of all kinds. Whether you're a small, radical activist company who's making touring shows, or whether you're an opera house, you still need to move towards sustainability. And so we produced guidance that would, yes, have very advanced standards to produce zero carbon shows, but would also create a first step on the ladder for businesses, companies, theatres who are unable to change what they do quickly, but could still start to move. And that, and Carmen's referred to this, seemed to us to be the really important thing. If you Google it online, it's quite easy to find guidance that imagines a future world in which theatre is conceived quite differently for a sustainable planet. It seemed to us that the real challenge now, with 8.5 years to go until 2030, is for people to start changing what they do today. And so we wanted to produce really pragmatic guidance that everybody could use starting now to make sure that their productions were as sustainable as possible. So we've produced the Theatre Green Book, and as Carmen said, it's only the first volume, but this is about sustainable productions, and I'm going to share my screen and just quickly take you through it now. So I'm hoping that everybody can see the front page of the Theatre Green Book. Now you'll notice that it says at the bottom that it's a beta version. That's a bit like software putting out a beta version and expecting people to trial it and wanting feedback so that it can be improved. And the Theatre Green Book is exactly the same. We know that we're not going to get everything right first time. We know that there will be some things that we think are going to be simple and turn out really difficult, and other things that we imagine might be a real challenge that theatre makers will actually find quite easy. So this is a beta version for trialing. We want theatres across the UK, across the rest of Europe, to sign up to work with the Green Book. No one is going to blame those who find it difficult. What we want is really honest feedback that will help us improve it and develop it as a collective task for theatre makers for the future. So there you'll see on the left that within the UK, across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, all of theatre has come together to make this. You'll recognise, some of you will recognise some of the names. This has been a real collective effort where the whole of theatre has come together to create a common standard for working sustainably. So the guidance is split into 4 parts. At the end, you can see it outlined in green, is a toolkit, which is resources for working sustainably that theatre makers have donated and given us from their own experience and expertise in working sustainably over the last 10 years. And we brought that together in one place. Before that, we start with, at a glance, to give people what are the key points about working sustainably. Then we go into those. You can see section 2, the principles, in more detail. But the heart of the Theatre Green Book is the guidance. And theatre makers kept saying to us, make it really clear. Make it really clear what I need to do differently as a producer, as a designer, as a writer. Because it's easy to find general guidance. The principles of working and living sustainably are all very familiar to us now. What people wanted was to know in detail what they needed to do. And you can see there, under the guidance, that we've divided this into 3 levels of standard. Baseline, which is the lowest level, intermediate, and then advanced. And an advanced level show is pretty much a carbon zero show. So looking at sustainable productions at a glance, and we start with the creative challenge. Because this is theatre, it is fundamentally a creative challenge. You can't add sustainability at the end. You can't make a sustainable production as an afterthought. In the conception of a show, in the way that directors and designers are thinking, sustainability needs to be built into that creative concept. Secondly, we've pulled out collaboration. Working sustainably is all about teamwork. You need to have the set constructor involved in conversations much earlier than usual so that their experience can go into finding sustainable solutions. Flexibility we pull out. As an example, a production manager was telling me about a time when they had in the store of their theatre something that was nearly the same as what the designer had produced, but the designer didn't want to use it because it didn't exactly match the vision. To work sustainably means flexibility from everybody, and that means, again, collaboration, so as to take the vision of a director and a designer and find the most sustainable way, working together, to turn it into a show. And finally, I've pulled out materials because this is all about materials. It's about sourcing and disposing of materials responsibly. Producing a show at a glance, and this is to underline a task not just for technical directors or for production managers. Producers too have to make sure that at the very first invitation, when they first bring together the creative team that's making a production, that it's clear that there is a standard for sustainability that everybody must work to. If you introduce sustainability later, it will feel like a restriction. If it's clear from the outset that it's part of the show, then everybody will work with it. Producers need to set the budget and schedule for sustainability. We don't think that sustainable shows need cost more, but you'll spend the money differently. There'll be more money on people's time and creativity, more money for designers, but less money going into materials. Key meetings are needed so that sustainability is discussed throughout the show, and reviewing and sharing at the end is incredibly important. For everybody in theatre, indeed, for all of us in whatever we do, sustainability is a process of learning. We're all going to need to learn to do things differently. And that means that reviewing and sharing is incredibly important so that theatre makers can learn as quickly as possible how to work sustainably. For people making sets, making costumes, making props, the key points that we've highlighted are about time. Designing and sourcing sustainably can take more time. It's easy to go online and buy costumes for a modern production. It takes much longer to go online and find secondhand ones. Materials, using reused and recycled materials as much as possible. And if not, making sure you're using sustainably sourced materials. And after the show, making sure that as much gets reused as possible. What we're trying to do is to move theatre, like everything else, from a linear model into a circular model. In other words, into a model where materials that are used in a show can then be reused afterwards. You're not throwing them away, you're not putting them into waste, you're trying to reclaim and salvage and use them again. And finally, for technical theatre, the challenge is slightly different. In technical theatre, equipment is very often hired and reused. So the challenge is about ensuring that your routines use as little energy as possible. And for example, looking at point number 3, that you're making sure there are as few deliveries as possible for technical equipment going into the show. So a sustainable production will go through all of the steps that a production normally works with, but all the way through sustainability, and the standard for sustainability will be part of the conversation. And when it comes to making sets and scenery and gathering materials for costumes and props, you're reusing and recycling as much as you possibly can. So at this point, in a minute, I'm going to jump forward to the guidance itself, which is the heart of the Theatre Green Book. But just to give you a glimpse of it, we also have a long section of principles for those of you who want to go into more detail about the thinking behind the Theatre Green Book. The Theatre Green Book, I should have said, is available free online. Everybody can download it. And I hope that we can share the website address later. So you can all take a look at this later and start to use it, I hope, and start to look at it. But for now, we're going to go straight forward to the guidance itself. And as I said before, theatre makers asked us to come up with really clear and specific guidance for how to make shows. And you can see there that we have 3 tiers of guidance: baseline guidance, which is the easiest to achieve, intermediate guidance, and advanced guidance, which is working in a zero carbon way. But I'll take you through the baseline form of guidance. And you can see in the column on the left that we've taken the steps of a production with which all theatre makers are familiar, starting with the invitation, bringing the team together, setting the budget and schedule, the concept, development, making, all the way through to disposal at the end of the show. 17 steps. And at the bottom, you can see 2 lines that won't apply to all shows. People working on outdoor shows or shows that are site specific, or people doing touring shows. We'll come back to those later. But for each of those 17 steps, there's a way of working that through the Green Book that enables the show to be made sustainably. So let's take the first one, invitation, making sure that the standard is made clear to everybody involved in the show before they start work. A production agreement, setting everybody on the show signing a green production agreement to show that they understand what the standard means and what to expect from everybody else working on it. Appointing the team early so that you know you have the set constructor, the production manager, available to help move the idea towards sustainability from the outset. Setting a sustainability champion who isn't like a policeman, but is there to help and to encourage and to inform. Setting the budget and schedule for the show so that it can be achieved sustainably. Making sure that there's a concept, an early meeting where sustainability is part of the discussion. Making sure that in development, when you have a sketch model, what in the UK we call a white card model, you're not only checking that the production is on time and on budget, you're also checking that you're meeting the sustainability target. I'm going to jump forward to this one. When you're making, and although some of these steps will seem very easy, and we want them to be easy because we want them to be part of how you already work, but there's also some hard guidance in here. Theatre making has to change meaningfully if the footprint of theatre is to shift and progress. And so we're saying that even on a baseline show, 50% of each category of materials in the production must come from a reused or recycled source. So costumes, props, scenery must be 50% from reused and recycled materials. Then the next one, new materials must be sourced as sustainably as possible. There's a piece of guidance about avoiding harmful materials and so on. And I'll jump forward to the last one, disposal. After the show, we expect people to make sure that 65% of materials are then reused and recycled. They don't get disposed to waste, but you're making sure that costumes go back to store or are sold on the second-hand market, that scenery is dismantled so that its materials can be used again. And you'll see as we go up to an intermediate show, that goes to 80%, and with an advanced show, 100% of materials should be reused and recycled. In the pages that follow, we take each of those standards, baseline, intermediate, and advanced, and go into more detail about whose task it is to do what. Producers, directors and designers, production managers, production staff, whose job is it to make sure that these standards are met? So for instance, that point of first invitation is a job for the producer. Preparing a green production agreement is a job for the producer. And you can see we've got some links here. That's to take you to the toolkit where you'll find an example of a green production agreement. We hope that this is easy for people to use. We don't want to create bureaucracy or paperwork. It's a practical tool for practical theatre making. And There's the same for intermediate shows. There's the same for advanced shows. And then finally, in the toolkit, theatre makers have come together to give us the sort of information that's helpful to you in making shows. So there is a typical green production agreement that anybody could use. We have some notes on the carbon calculators that are available. We don't recommend using them yet for making theatre, but we think in a few years' time they'll be very important. And this lists the ones that are already in existence. Training in climate literacy, and these are the places where you can find that in the UK at the moment. Some more detail on budgeting. Materials inventories, which are like a very simple carbon calculator, so that you can record where all the materials in a show come from and what happens to them afterwards. And we've created a very simple Excel spreadsheet that people can use to do that. Guidance on workshops, resources for reuse and recycling, a guidance on how to make sets so that they can be disassembled for reuse, and guidance on sustainable sourcing of timber and other products, and so on. Lots of guidance on costume making that was put together by costume supervisors, and on lighting that was put together by lighting designers. And then finally, some guidance on outdoor shows and on touring. On the last page, this list of thanks and acknowledgements, you'll see that a huge number of people in UK theatre, people who are practically working making shows, directors, production managers, set makers, have come together to produce this guidance. It really has been produced by theatre for theatre. And what we now want is for it to go out, for people to start using it as soon as possible and feed back to us so that collectively we can continue to develop it and move it forward. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and Carmen, pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Paddy, for this insight to the Theatre Green Book. And I think it made it very clear how easy to use it actually is and how practical it is installed. For me, there's a first question just as an information, like how many theaters are trying the Green Book now, are using it? Is it how many in the UK, or is it spreading already internationally? What is your feedback?
At the moment, it's because we did it for UK theatre, not I think really at the start, thinking how important it is that actually collectively we're doing this together. And so it began by talking to UK theatres. Then we realised early on that there's some really good advice elsewhere that we could draw on. So we had an early conversation with Thierry Leonardi at Opéra Lyon in France, who's been doing some fantastic work around carbon calculators. We had early conversations with the Broadway Green Alliance, who've done some work for New York theatres, and with the Canadian Green Alliance as well, and was starting to bring together whatever we could find. I think now the experience of making theatre is the same everywhere. The need to share shows, the need to be able to tour, the need for artists to be able to travel and work in different places makes it, to me, really important that the more we can learn from each other and share and converge our guidance until it's using the same methodology, working in the same place, the more successful that will be. And so when we began some conversations that Carmen led to NT Gent becoming involved, that was a really, really positive step. And we really hope that we can more and more continue these conversations and start to see trialing happening really across a very, very broad area.
And maybe I can add there how we actually, or how it's developing at NT Gent with the Theatre Green Book. Because I saw it as well in the Fundus. There's a mirror board where people can add their questions and ideas and what they want to talk about. And there was as well the question, how can we get over this point of not acting? How can we take away this perception of the people that they don't know how to start? And for us, it was a great help to use the Theatre Green Book, because it's something that we can do from bottom up, so the whole team is involved from the start. It's not something hurriedly that we say the director decides to do something. No, it's something that we do completely in a team, that we can test, that there are clear challenges that we have to to solve together, kind of. And it's a very helpful start to set up a team that wants to work on it, instead of, I say, only talking. I mean, the talking is important as well, but there's a start, and there's a start as well to change perspective. So that, for example, I'm as a dramaturg, I talk about sustainability, not only with dramaturgs now, but with the whole department, the technical department, with the director's assistants, to the set designer, to everybody. And that was the other interesting thing, that often you say, we want to produce sustainable, and everybody is nodding and saying, yes, yes, we do, but nobody knows what it actually means practically. So you talk and you say, yeah, we have a standard there. Yeah, I have worked many times with this standard, but nobody knows what this means. So that was very interesting to actually come together and actually have to make a first step to define what is it and what are our goals over all the departments.
And I think it's a really important thing that we won't know how to work sustainably until we start trying. You know, we could spend another 8.5 years trying to write perfect guidance. And we don't pretend that the Theatre Green Book is perfect, but we do think it's the best we can manage as a vision for making theatre sustainably now. To make it better means working with it, means theatre makers practically making shows in a sustainable way and then feeding back. And together we can then improve the standards and develop them to come up with something even better. But it's not something that you can do as a theory or do on paper. It can only be done by people actually making shows in a sustainable way and learning from doing it. And there is a huge frustration, I think. We've, you know, the first piece of work that I remember doing in the field of climate change was back in the 1990s. You know, that's 20, 30 years ago, and real change has not been happening. And it's only by embarking on the process of change that we can accelerate towards a world in which theatre is being made responsibly. And I think it's incredibly important that this happens, because if we're to address the climate emergency that we all face, it has to be through cultural organizations being able to talk about the climate emergency, and being able to be part of the debate and conversation around it. And theatre can only do that if it changes its own practice and can be seen to be working responsibly. That's why I think this is such an urgent and such an important thing to achieve.
And I would like to already connect what you have been saying to some questions that came up in the Slido app. So the first one, because we are often talking about the theater, and we already shortly talked about how the Green Book is spreading, and there was the question, how usable actually the Theatre Green Book that started in the UK is for the end to Gent. And I have to say, what I already mentioned, the psychological effect is the same, I think, if you use the Theatre Green Book in the UK or in Belgium or in Germany. Of course, what we can see if you click through the tool links, that these are pages that refer to the UK. So if it's where to find, for example, secondhand costumes or material that is recycled, these links, Toolkit is UK specific, but this actually gives us already a guidance to build the same for Belgium, to find the local adaptations, to actually, the Theatre Green Book stays the same, but all the tools, the different possibilities, we of course will have to add from a Belgian perspective. And this is very important, but this is actually as well what is the fun about it, to find solutions together. And there is already as well a great knowledge in Belgium about sustainability. It's just that the step that the Green Book is doing now has not been done to actually bring it all together in one tool. So this is a bit the answer. Of course, it's UK specific a bit, but there is a general agreement for all, I would say, at least European countries that we can use.
I think on that point, the toolkit, the resources section, we put that together in about a month. It was really easy to do it because there are so many people working in theatre who've been thinking about this for a long time. And I started getting emails from scenic painters, from costume supervisors, from lighting designers, all of whom had already been doing the research on where they could find more sustainable materials. And they were all happy to share them in a toolkit. So I think it's exactly right that for different regions of Europe, will come up with their own resources, but the principles of working apply to theatre everywhere.
And about the tools, there's a very concrete question as well. The question why you would recommend to postpone the use of the carbon calculators, although there's already a large number and different versions existing.
And I think there's two reasons for that. And to be clear, we think carbon calculators are incredibly important. And probably in 5 or 10 years' time, they'll be used very naturally, and that will be just a part of not only theatre making, but a lot of the other things that we do. The reason we do recommend them for advanced shows now. For baseline and intermediate shows, there were a couple of reasons why we didn't, and this was on the advice of our sustainability specialists. The first is that of the calculators that are out there now, and there are quite a few, a lot of them are quite general. They're looking at everything to do with theatre, to do with travel, to do with transport, to do with buildings. They're not designed specifically for shows. So they're important tools, but they're not particularly applicable to productions. I know that there are some calculators being developed which are much more specific to productions. And once they're fully tested and fully used, then we may look at that advice again. I think the second reason is that theatre making everywhere is made under a huge degree of stress. Everybody is already working too hard. Everybody is already under pressure of time and of budget. And we didn't want to make the process more onerous, more difficult. And at the moment, certainly in UK theatre, there isn't a high level of climate or carbon literacy. If you asked somebody, what is the carbon footprint of a really sustainable show or of a bad show, nobody would know the answer to that. People could tell you what an expensive show or a cheap show looked like, but we don't have in our heads a sense of how carbon works for theatre. And until that develops, they're only partly useful as a tool. I think the final reason why we decided not to introduce them yet is that the really important thing we'd discovered through conversation is that sustainability had to be collaborative. And as soon as the center of it is a carbon calculator, then the person who owns the calculator becomes responsible for sustainability. We want everybody to be responsible, the producer, the director, the designer, the production manager. And for all of those reasons together, we said not yet. For now, well, I think one more reason is that until more data is gathered on shows about their carbon footprint, it's very hard to build a calculator which you can be entirely sure of. And I know some people are working on those, and as I say, they will be very useful. But for the moment, we thought, no, let's make this as simple as we possibly can.
Thank you. Because you have been saying, or you mentioned the data that is still missing for many Belgians and Germans. It feels like in the UK, the topic of sustainability is already very accepted, and there's a lot of work about it. For example, I think most people know Julie's bicycle. It's very, very popular. Do you see there a difference between the UK and other European nations, or is it just something that looks for us like the UK would be further?
I mean, I don't know is the honest answer. And I think it depends on the perspective you take. I have spoken to people in UK theatre who have no real understanding of sustainability at all and don't think of it as important and are not going to do anything. And I've talked to people in theatre across the rest of Europe who are utterly committed to changing and creating a radical new way of working. So I think it's very even. I think there are people everywhere for whom this is a high priority, and people who are not seeing how they can adapt their work to the parameters of the climate emergency. And I think that, you know, there's been a lot of conversation. You mentioned Julie's Bicycle, who are one of the partners in this project. There is a lot of talk in British theatre, but in terms of actual change, actual achievement, actual progress, that I don't think there's been more than elsewhere. I really hope that the Theatre Green Book will be that spur to change, and it feels as if everybody in UK theatre is very much coming behind it. But one of the reasons why this is such an important and an exciting conversation is that if there's anything that can help theatre makers elsewhere move forwards, that's really great. And also that the wider the feedback we can pull in, then collectively we can make this a better tool. I really believe more theatres working on this, wherever they are, will make this a better tool that we can all use together.
And there is a big challenge, or it's a global challenge that we are facing, not a national challenge. So I think this is the very important point of the Green Book, that it is actually globally usable, and you just have to exchange some of the links inside. Because of course, for example, detouring is a great or a big point of discussion. And I think later on there will be as well a whole workshop about touring possibilities and how to make them green, as there is a possibility to see each other separate and by borders. Climate crisis is showing us this very clearly, that there are no borders. I have one very practical question, because I'm checking at the same time the Slido about the two other versions of the, or not versions, but parts of the Theatre Green Book about operations and buildings. And there's the concrete question when they will be published.
So we're working at the moment on the second volume of the Theatre Green Book, which is about making theatre buildings more sustainable. And that will be ready in about 2 months' time. Then we're going to move on to the third volume, which is about theatre operations. And by that we mean the foyers, the catering, the front of house, managing theatre offices, managing dressing rooms and rehearsals, managing travel. And that will be available in the autumn, perhaps in September or October. By then, we hope that we'll have feedback from productions that are starting to open, having been made with sustainable productions. And so by the end of the year, we think all three parts of the Theatre Green Book should be available fully for people to use. But I'd really want to stress that the version of sustainable productions that we've been talking about and looking at today is ready to use. You can make shows with it now, and we would really welcome it if people wanted to sign up to start using it, or just use it for yourselves, but do give us feedback afterwards once you've learnt from making shows with it.
Thank you. There are as well, and maybe you can answer some of the question in Slido afterwards, because there's some concrete questions about the next parts of the book that you can maybe answer about how to use to work with clay and wood, so very specific already about the material, because I would like to use the last 5 minutes to talk about one question that just popped up a minute ago, and I think is a very important one. And I think the Gent works with lots of international partners, particularly from the Global South. is a potential green book standard another Eurocentristic perspective? And I think it's a big point, and in the heart of many discussions. And for me, it's a bit what I said in the introduction. The Green Book Standard is a base on which we can build. And of course, we will have to always adapt. We will see some things are not working. How do we do it? But it actually starts or keeps us starting to do things. And of course, it's what I said as well, Eurocentristic as well in the way what kind of links, what kind of resources we can actually get and use and we have access to, which are not there in other parts. Yeah. But if I just think, for example, about our production that we started in the Amazon in Brazil, and then we had to stop because of the COVID lockdown and had to go back. I mean, there everything is recycled, everything is reused in the MST. It's the movement of the workers without land. So there's actually, they would look at us to say, hey Europe, what are you doing to buy this newly? This is the whole culture, and what we learn as well, what made us very aware of how we work. And yes, there will be still flying, but it's not about cutting everything to zero, but to actually think about, we shouldn't fly 10 times back and forth for a touring, for example, but then coordinate with other theaters. How can we do it effectively to avoid flights that are not necessary? So for me, there is no contradiction to start with the Theater Green Book and develop from there on as well other international perspectives.
Can I jump in there?
Of course.
Carmen, because I think what you said is incredibly important and valuable. One of the things that makes me really confident about moving forwards with this method, with this initiative we're talking about, is that all theatre makers know how to make shows sustainably. Because at the start of your careers, when you have no money and no resources, everybody is making shows through reuse and recycling. And so there's something that large-scale theatres can learn from small-scale theatres about working sustainably. And I think the same thing applies with theatre makers in the global south. So I think the question is a really good one to ask. But just as you were implying, Carmen, I think I'd turn it round the other way and say it's not about the Green Book teaching people in the global south how to make theatre sustainably. It's about us learning from theatre makers who have less resource about how to tell stories, how to connect with audiences when you are not using material. So the learning is going in the opposite direction, and it's a really important part of this process.
Thank you very much, Paddy. I think these are beautiful words to actually round up, and I will share as well the link to the Theatre Green Book on the Fundus page, so the page where you can find all materials and links. I'm happy as well to put down there's some contact details that Paddy already shared as well in Slido, so that there's a roundup, and that you can have a closer look to the Theatre Green Book, and I hope many of you will be inspired to test it actually in reality.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Paddy.
Thanks very much. It's been really good to talk about it. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.